r/NoSleep. Posted by u/doomedgeek. Hidden in the depths, the drowned man waits. The call of the blood. The flesh on his bones. That was what saved me. I am 25 and working a summer job as a researcher as part of my university course. I am staying in what was basically an old shack with minimum amenities. There was meant to be 2 other students here, but neither had turned up. That worked for me. I am kind of a loner and definitely a nerd. The nearest thing that could claim to be civilization was a small town 10 miles away. Pop. 500, New Merton was 1 street and a couple of stores. When I first arrived and was stocking up, I asked, jokingly, what had happened to Old Merton. The storekeeper arched a gray, bushy eyebrow and told me it had gone to a watery grave. Love it, I exclaimed. This did not go down well. From the storekeeper's expression I thought I was going to be asked to leave. Luckily, my foraging skills being non-existent, he explained instead. I was born in Old Merton, a lot of folk around here were, then 20 years ago we had our homes compulsory purchased by the state. They were constructing a new reservoir and their grand scheme meant destroying our hometown. It was flooded, submerged. It was a sin. His words trailed off and he gazed into a distance I figured only he could see. I paid and left with my boxes of beans and powdered milk. When I got back to my shack I looked up Old Merton on the maps I had as part of my work and found one that still showed it. The storekeeper's beloved hometown had once stood a mile to the west of me. That evening I walked out to the reservoir. It was massive, more like a landlocked ocean, I remember thinking, than a man-made lake. I stared down into the water and wondered if anything was left of the town. I did not think of Old Merton again until about 6 weeks later. The weather had been mighty hot for that whole period. I slept less and less as even at night the temperature was off the scale. A full-blown heat wave was gripping the area and it was not good. One morning, about 6 a.m., I had given up on sleep and was out for a walk to try and clear my head. I could already tell the day was shaping up to be another scorcher. I reached the reservoir and it was then I saw it. A dark point rising out of the water. Strange, I thought, and went back to the shack to get a pair of binoculars. They showed me clear as could be what had appeared. The spire of a chapel. I was mystified for a moment but then it came back to me. Old Merton. There was a chapel in New Merton, its whitewashed panels presenting a modest front to the world. Was this its predecessor? I guess the heat wave must have caused the water level in the reservoir to fall and this highest trace of the town below had been exposed. It was amazing but I had experiments to tend to, work to do. Over the days that followed the heat grew ever more merciless and I found myself returning to the reservoir's edge early in the morning and in the evening on the cusp of dusk. The water level continued to fall and more of Old Merton was being revealed. The roofs of buildings, of the chapel, of a line of buildings mirroring each other, the old main street, I supposed. They reached up, stained dark and rotted away in places but they were clearly the town's remains. I saw windows, street lamps, as the weeks passed and the effects of the relentless heat continued. I saw a bandstand, the roof of a truck. Its owner must have abandoned it. In a remarkably short period of time I could see the outlines of the streets below the last of the water. The reservoir had run almost completely dry. A few people drove out from New Merton at first, but I guess all seeing the place did was bring back bitter memories of the way they had been treated. So before long there was only me looking out over the town on my daily pilgrimages. There was some coverage in the local paper, in one national, and some of the TV networks included a syndicated filmed clip in their hourly summaries. There was too much urgency elsewhere in the world. There was corruption. There were wars overseas. There was tragedy of every scale and shade, including the heat wave, which was proving deadly for some. That was heartbreaking. The shell of a small town in the far end of nowhere seeing blue skies for the first time in 2 decades soon drifted out of interest. That suited me just fine. One Saturday morning I set off walking down towards the remains of Old Merton. I was taking time off from my work and had decided to go properly explore the town. It was very humid, very close. The first clouds I had seen in many a day had gathered not long after first light and it looked like a storm was on the way. It was this that had prompted me to overcome my nerves. From a distance the town looked eerie, even the thought of walking its once streets made my guts rumble with nervousness. But this was most likely a once-in-a-lifetime experience. I grasped the moment. I slid and stumbled down the side of the reservoir and by the time I reached the basin I was drenched in sweat. A layer of brown-black earth covered the ground. It was dry to the touch. Barren, I thought, then I saw a silver-tinted shape a few feet away. I went over, knelt down to look more closely and saw it was the remains of a fish. It must have suffocated and its body desiccated by the sun. Now I had seen one, I saw they were everywhere. The reservoir must have been rich with fish, now it was a charnel house for them. I stood, wiped my hands on my jeans and continued into the town itself. There was no wind, no sound apart from my labored breathing. Overhead, the sky was darkening as the clouds continued to gather. I could have been on another world as I turned onto what had once been the main street. The facades of all the buildings had been stripped of their features. Jagged shards of glass remained in some of the windows. I saw the truck I had first spotted from my vantage point high above where I now was. One of its wheels was missing. I peered inside, saw a crushed beer can in the footwell. What I wouldn't have given for a cold beer at that moment. I tapped the bonnet and moved on. I made my way down the street. There were no personal belongings that I could see. The townsfolk must have taken everything that could be carried with them. The dark earth lined every floor inside every building I looked in. There was nothing here in this abandoned place. This sacrifice on the altar of progress. I had seen enough. I decided to leave. I walked towards the far end of the main street. The slope of the reservoir looked less steep in that direction, easier, I hoped, to climb out of. I reached the last building, glanced through the broken window for one final look into the heart of the town. I wished that I never had. There was a skeleton in the room into which I was looking. A human. An adult from its size. It lay sprawled on the ground. Cable ties bound its wrists and ankles. I suddenly felt very cold. The oppressive heat of the day was no barrier to the fear which rushed through me. I wiped stinging sweat from my eyes. What the hell should I do? As I considered, I felt the first spots of rain begin to strike. The storm was breaking. I put that out of my mind. I couldn't leave the skeleton like that, I decided. It had once been a person. I could not just walk away. I tried the door to the building. It opened easily at my touch. I stepped inside. The silence of the day followed me and the sound of my footsteps on the dry, dark earth covering the floor was a whisper in my ear. A warning. Turn around. Leave. I did not listen. My mind was playing tricks on me. All there was the remains of a dead man. He couldn't hurt me. Reaching his side, I saw that the cable ties were plastic, of a type that does not decay. Some of the bones had become detached, though they still lay pretty much in place. I reached down, lifted up one of the long leg bones that had separated from the whole. I had never held a human bone before. I know how morbid this sounds, but for a moment I forgot my fear. I was fascinated. I ran my finger along the bone, expecting it to be smooth, but it felt rough. I brought it closer to study it. There were jagged indentations all along it. Was it the effects of the water, I wondered, and then froze. Out of the corner of my eye I could see someone standing in the doorway. It was a man, older than me. Heavy-set. He was dabbing at his forehead with a handkerchief. He was looking past me, to the skeleton. I thought he was my friend, he said. Only he was fooling around with my wife. She did not see it that way, thought he was in love with her, as she was in love with him. She left me, but he did not want her. I would have forgiven her, would have welcomed her back, but she was devastated. Took her own life. He paused, took out a knife. Fear reached out and touched me once again. So I brought him here and bound him and left him hidden from sight to wait for the water to come when the reservoir was filled. I did not want an easy death for him. I wanted him to know terror. And now the water is returning. He looked over at the window. I followed his gaze to outside. The rain was falling heavy now. It was all you could see. I'm sorry, the man continued. I saw what happened on the news and got here as soon as I could. I was going to move him in case anyone found him. Turns out I'm too late. It's not a problem, I stammered. I won't tell anyone. I'll just walk away. He shook his head, looked sad. No, son, you won't. It happened real quick then. He charged at me with the blade. I lashed out blindly with the bone I still held and caught him on the side of his head. He crumpled to the ground. A gash had opened up and blood flowed freely. He seemed to be unconscious. I did not think. I fled, out of the building back onto what had been the street. The rain hit me. Its force took me by surprise and I stood there gasping for a moment. Long enough to see that there were things in the brown-black earth. Shapes, encased in it. They had been hidden before, but as the rain struck their covering was slowly being washed away, revealing them. I could make out half a dozen, more. My God, they were everywhere. They reminded me of lungfish. I had only seen pictures. There were no lungfish in this country that I knew of. How had they come to be here? To this day, I cannot explain this, or what they truly were. These things, with long winding bodies that made me think of snakes, and had wispy fins. Small dark eyes which seemed to sparkle with intelligence. They were bigger than any lungfish I had ever read about. Much bigger. And they had teeth. Some lungfish have crude teeth. Primitive stumps. These had long, razor-sharp teeth. And they began to wriggle. They had survived, somehow, and now they were freeing themselves from the earth, beginning to move. They dragged themselves across the now increasingly muddy surface. Pools of water had begun to appear as well, and soon they would be able to swim in bursts. I wiped my eyes. The rain fell harder, and all I could do was stand there and watch, hypnotized by the sight of these creatures being seemingly resurrected as the grip of the drought was released. I still clutched the drowned man's bone, could feel the roughness in its surface, and with a mounting sense of horror it dawned on me. What if they were bite marks, that had been made by these creatures? They moved closer, almost as if they were heading for me. And a new thought struck me, what if they had got a taste for human flesh? Because now it was back within their reach. They continued to move towards me. I only had seconds to act. I looked around for the best route to escape, and saw the murderer. He was stepping out of the building, struggling to walk but holding the knife high. My attention was torn between it and the blood dripping from the man's wound into the mud, trickling through the pools. It was sending the creatures into a frenzy. The man had not seen them until then. His jaw dropped when he did. At that moment the creatures began to move as one, towards him. I took my chance. I turned and ran. I did not look back. I heard screams. In my mind I saw earth and water running dark with blood. Flesh being torn from bone by razor-sharp teeth. I ran faster and did not stop until I was clear of the town and the reservoir and back in my shack. That was 7 days ago. The rain has continued to fall and now all I can see from the reservoir's edge is the spire. The town is returning to the deep, still water and taking with it its secrets.